In this video, we're going to work with CSS Grid to lay out this HTML page. We're also going to use media queries to rearrange this page for a smaller screen size. We're going to make it responsive for a medium one, where we move the sidebar to the top, and also for a small one, where we have all of the images on their, or text boxes, all the elements on their own row. So let's start with the large, because that really does give us the best scenario where we're going to be using the grid. Although today it's really best to start designing with a small screen size and mobile devices. That's the way most people access a site initially. They have their phones on them all the time. So it's actually a good idea to start designing from this perspective, but we'll go ahead and design with a large one. Before we start coding, let's go over CSS Grid. There are two different displays that are used commonly today, namely Flexbox, which we already learned about, and Grid, and you can actually use them together. So Grid came out in around 2017, and it has widespread adoption. Now you could assume that pretty much every browser you're going to be using supports this Grid display. The basics are as follows. We're going to define a container element with display grid and then set the column size and the row size using grid template columns and grid template rows. If we want more fine-grained control over where elements are placed in the grid, we could then use grid column and grid row. But we're primarily just going to start with an example using the first three commands. I would encourage you to read through all of the terminology associated with CSS Grid, but that will give us a good start on how to use it to lay out a page that has a grid-like design. Let's get coding. So to start things off, we have our boilerplate set up right here. And again, if you don't remember, Emmet is supported in VS Code. If we do HTML:5, hit enter, it'll give us our boilerplate. Now let's go ahead and rename this to grid, and I'm using live preview, so you'll see the right side auto update. Let's get all of these elements on the page and not worry about styling, but just set up the actual semantics of the page. So we have our container to contain it all. So that'll contain the sidebar and the main section over here. Let's make this a little bigger just as we build this out. So I'm going to use Emmet, and if I do .container, it'll create a class or a div with container as the class. So that'll get me started. Now we need the sidebar, and then we have the main content. So I'm going to use nav as the for the sidebar, and I'll put side nav bar in there. Then we will have the main content, and there's a lot in the main content, so I'll just go ahead and put that all right here. There's an argument to say you could put header, then footer, then inside this put main, but that gets a little bit more nesting that I want to do. So then in here we'll do the header, which I'll just put header. Then we have three text boxes. So I'm going to contain those in their own container. So let's just call this text, and inside of that div, I'm going to create 3. So I'll multiply by 3. Oh, actually I need to put the Emmet command first. So I do .text, and then I multiply that by 3, hit enter, and I could have filled this out as well, but I'll just fill them out now. Okay, after the text container, I'm going to create an images container, and inside of there, I'm going to just put .image, and I could go ahead and put images, but I'll just use CSS styling to create these. So I'll do just image times 2, and that will be image, and this will also be image. The last thing we'll need is the footer. So let's put that in here with footer inside. So that gets the semantics of the page set up. The last thing we need to do before we move on to our CSS is to import the style.css tag. So I could do link CSS, and we have that right there. So let's head over to our CSS. Okay, so the CSS is the bulk of what we're going to be working with here. To give myself a little more room, I'm going to move this down for the time being. I will keep it here just for reference, but let's I'm going to just import a couple things. You don't need to necessarily watch me type all this out, but the first thing I want to do is I want to import some colors. So I'm using CSS variables to define the colors that are used in this image right here, and I can use them later. By putting them in root, I'll just know it's accessible everywhere. I'm going to do a little bit of a CSS reset and just adjust some styling. So I'm going to adjust the margin to be 0, so it bumps up right against the side. I'm going to use a sans serif font. I'm going to use box sizing so that the borders we build are included in the calculation for the height and the width. We will look at using an off-white color just to make everything pop a little more when we color them. So that made it a little ugly right now, but we'll fix that. And we also have min height, and we made the font size a little bit bigger. The reason we needed to use the min height, if we pull up the inspector, the body won't take up the whole space. It'll just take up what it needs, unless if I say, okay, use 100% of the viewport height. So let's go ahead and move that box down, the inspector down to the bottom, and get going with the actual layout. So the next thing I'm going to do is just put all of the colors in place. Again, you could pause the video, copy this in if you like, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'll just copy them in. So we have the nav with the background color set to the variable colored blue, and you can see that for the rest. Then the last thing I want to do for the different pieces is put the border in. So if we look at these, we want all of the different elements to have a border. So what we can do is I want the body, and then I want to select all of its descendants, and all of the descendants, I will have a border of 1 pixel solid black. So that just gives us a little bit of separation. So it's time to start setting up the grid. So to start things off, I'm going to take the sidebar, move that to the left, and have the main content on the right. So to do that in our CSS, I'm going to target the container and change its display to grid. Now grid will also need to define the template we're going to use. So we're going to use grid, and we have 2 options of template columns, template rows. We have a few more, but we'll just focus on the template columns, template rows for now. So template columns is what we want to use here. So we want, if we're looking at this sidebar is taking up 2 of the 12 units, and then this main content is taking up 10 of the 12 units. And that 12 is just really coming back from Bootstrap. You don't have to work with 12 specifically when it comes to CSS Grid, but what we're going to say is 12 of the fractional units are going to be broken 2 to the first one and then 10 to the second element. So this says 2 of the fractional units go to the first element, which is just the side nav bar, and then 10 of them go to this main content. You could also reduce this down to as a 1/5 instead, and you can see it's the same. But fractional units are commonly used with grid. So now within main, we want to use rows as the template instead. So here, when I target the main content, the display will still be grid, but now I'll do grid template rows, and there's going to be 4 of them. The first one is, and the header and the footer are half the height of the text boxes and the images. So what we'll do is say that the header gets 1 fractional unit, and we'll just consider this as ratio. So the text boxes get 2 fractional units, the images get 2 fractional units, and the footer gets 1 fractional unit. This little leftover space right here is just because the images are just going to take the space it needs. So there's a little bit left over when it comes to the layout. But that'll be adjusted when we do essentially the same thing with the text boxes and the images. So .text right here is also going to be a display of grid. And just to show you something a little bit differently, the is going to be a column again. So grid template columns, but they're all going to be equally sized. So what we can do is use the repeat, and we could repeat 3 times 1FR, which then gives us this desired result. And then the last one is going to be for images. So the images display grid, and the template that we're going to be using is again columns. And this time we'll repeat 2 times 1FR. All right. Now, everything is kind of all over the place right here. So the first thing we'll do is make sure this takes up the whole space. So if we're inspecting this, you can see our body is all of this, but the sidebar, the nav bar only needs this. So let's go ahead and actually add a little bit more to the, let's go ahead and just do it to the container. We want this container to fill up the entire viewport. So what I'll do is say its height is 100 VH, and now you can see that's taking up the entire viewport. The next thing I want to do is I want to center all of these texts. And the easiest thing to do to center is really just to use Flexbox. So what I'm going to do is all of these within the container need to be centered. So we need to select that somehow. So what we'll use is some operators for CSS. So we want to affect all of the text boxes. We also want to affect all of the images, and we will just use the comma combinator. So we'll have the header, we have the footer, and we also have the nav bar. So these are all of the different ones we want to affect. So what we'll do is we'll make them display flex, and then once you make them display flex, you could justify the content to be centered, and you could align the items to be in the center. So this is really pretty much done, at least without the responsiveness. So the next thing we'll work on is the responsive design. That is to say, when I shrink this, I want the sidebar to slide to the top. And to do that, we'll use media queries. So the first media query we're going to look at is one that involves the screen, and we want to apply rules to whenever the screen is smaller. So the max width that we'll apply these rules to are the ones that are 768 pixels or smaller. So right now, when you could always look at the size, if you have the developer console open, in the upper right-hand corner, it's showing you the pixels. So 768 is right about there. So anything smaller than this should affect should apply the rules that we put inside of this media query. So it's a little hard to see unless if you zoom in, but now this is 761 pixels. So let's go ahead and think about what we have to do. We need to take this sidebar and move up top. So that means the container, instead of a 1 fractional unit and a 5 fractional unit, the column, there should just be 1 fractional unit. And it should just, so what we'll do is we don't need to do display grid again because we already have the rules above are going to carry over, but only the rules inside of here will apply when the max width is less than 768 pixels. So the columns will now just be 1 fractional unit. So you can see this is now moved it to the top. This looks a little bit ugly because the nav bar really doesn't need that much screen real estate. So what we'll do is say grid template column, our row here is, let's think about it. This first element, maybe 1 fractional unit, and then the main body, let's say 10 fractional units. The sidebar does so, now the top bar, but the nav bar doesn't need that much space. So that's how we would use the media query. And to see this in action, when I make it larger, you can see the sidebar goes over to the left, but once I go below that 768 pixels, the nav bar goes to the top. So continuing this idea, we want these to change when we get smaller. So a good breakpoint to use for a small screen size is 480 pixels. So there's 478. So what we'll do here is make another media query for the screen, and the max width here will be 480 pixels. So what do we need to do? We need to change the grid template for the text boxes. So the .text, the grid template columns are now going to just be 1 instead of 3. So there'll be 1 fractional unit. So that is now, there's 1 column, and it is just going to take up each of the entire width. And we'll have to do the same thing for the images. So we'll just do a quick copy and paste. So that's how you would approach this problem using CSS Grid and responsive design.